Hey guys, happy Friday. We are going to be looking at economic and political progressivism this day. And we're going to be starting off by looking at how we try and fix politics and voting during the progressive era. We start off actually at the lowest level in city reforms, and it'll build up from there. The whole point of this level of reform was to increase government efficiency by having it run by experts, not politicians. And by politicians, I mean the power of the corrupt political machines. This was preceded or somewhat inspired by the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which we've talked about before, in which the positions in the national government required you to show some level of merit to actually receive the position. Now, of these various new types of city governments, we have three major ones we're going to look at. The first is the mayor-council form, in which the mayor and the city council are going to be elected by voters. The mayor is going to then appoint heads of the city departments. In the council-manager form, voters elect a city council who selects one of their own as a mayor. The city council will then also appoint a city manager who in turn selects the heads of the city departments. And finally, we have the commission form. Voters will elect the city council, who appoints a city manager, who will then select commissioners of the major departments like finance, fire, or the police commission. Um, the idea of this came from Galveston, Texas, as a response to the hurricane that happened there in 1900. Um, it was because they needed extra support in certain areas, at that time, specifically fire, police, and public works. Despite the differences in the structures of all of these, they are all designed with the same purpose: to give citizens more direct control over how their cities are run. From there, we move up to the state reform, and you can't talk about state reforms without this guy, Governor Robert Fightin' Bob Lafayette from Wisconsin. He was one of the most prominent progressives in politics at the time, known as being one of the greatest congressmen and senators in U.S. history later on. He gained national attention when muckraking journalist Lincoln Steffens, who we talked about today, began to cover his campaign. And as governor, he championed numerous progressive reforms, including railroad rate reform, the direct primary, allowing citizens to actually decide which people they wanted on the ballot for their political party. He also had the first workers' compensation system, direct legislation of initiative and referendum, which we'll talk about in just a moment. He created a minimum wage, women's suffrage in Wisconsin, all kinds of things that were meant to increase the level of democracy in the state. He actually worked with the University of Wisconsin to encourage students to look into these ideas and to support these ideas, saying or making Wisconsin into a quote unquote laboratory for democracy. Of the state reforms that he created, there's three that I want to look at. The first of these is the initiative. This says that citizens are allowed to initiate, or rather introduce, new legislation. If you feel like something needs to change, like you think that the speed limit needs to be lowered, or you think that the age for buying cigarettes needs to go up, those types of things, we as citizens actually have the ability to write our own laws and then submit it for approval. We then also have the referendum. This allows legislation to be submitted to the voters for approval. So this means that our state legislature comes up with a potential law, and they give it to us, the voters, to then decide if we approve it or not. And usually this is for something that is specifically for changing the lives of the people in the state. So a good example recently was the Prop 8 that came out on the ballot a few years ago. Next and finally, we have the recall. This allows voters to remove an elected official from office before the end of their term. Let's say that you elect a guy and you think he's going to be great, and then he gets in there and it turns out he just sucks. What do? You're just stuck with him for the next few years? That's horrible. That's a terrible idea. So instead, we are now allowed to remove someone from office through a recall and then replace them with someone else. This happened here in California just a few years ago in 2003, where we decided that our governor, Gray Davis, was not doing a good job. And so we had a recall election and we replaced him with the governor. From there, we have national reforms, some of which we've already talked about. The first two, which were inspired by the populists, the 16th Amendment with the graduated income tax, and the 17th Amendment for the direct election of senators, where the citizens of a state get to actually directly vote for who their senators are, rather than the state legislature getting to choose it for them. And also an idea somewhat supported by the populists and would become more popular as time goes on, women's suffrage, which we'll talk a lot about next class. From here, we move on to economic reforms. And we talked a lot about the business abuses of this time. So the first of them we look at is railroads. The problem with these railroads is that they were using rebates and pools and all kinds of unfair business practices. And this was causing us to have some major problems. So the next thing we do is we create the Interstate Commerce Commission, which started to regulate the railroads. We then are going to improve this with the Elkins Act. And this amended the Interstate Commerce Act, or that created the Interstate Commerce Commission, that allowed them to impose fines on railroads that offered rebates, and also on the shippers that accepted the rebates. We then went one step further with the Hepburn Act, which allowed the ICC power to set maximum railroad rates. So that said that you can no longer have like the free passes for loyal shippers. It also allowed them to view the railroad's financial records and to make sure that they were using good bookkeeping and all kinds of other things. It was really beneficial for kind of reining in the worst abuses of the railroads. The next problem that we have in business is trusts and monopolies. They were manipulating the market, usually at the expense of the consumer. So the first of these things, which we've talked about, was the Sherman Antitrust Act. And this was initially saying, hey, there's a monopoly. You shouldn't do that. And that's about all they could do. It was really not that effective. So we go ahead and we have a Supreme Court case that actually tests this. And that's known as United States versus E.C. Knight, or the Sugar Trust case. This particular case said that the American Sugar Refining Company had acquired almost all the sugar producing capacity in the United States, and thus it went against the Sherman Antitrust Act. However, this was later on overturned because it said that, unfortunately, it did not go under the interstate commerce connection under the Constitution for Congress. So we decided we needed to boost this a little bit more, and we create the Clayton Antitrust Act. This is where the Antitrust Acts get some teeth. It specified particular prohibited conduct. There was an enforcement scheme, as well as the remedial measures to try and fix these abuses from happening in the future. Next, we're going to look at specific business reforms. And we've talked about this before with the Gospel of Wealth, which was created by Andrew Carnegie, stated that the rich have a moral obligation to give away their fortunes. He said that personal wealth beyond what was required to supply your basic needs should be given back to the community. And so he established public libraries, giving over $50 million to build libraries throughout the English-speaking world, and gave away over $350 million overall. Other business titans of the time donated part of their vast fortunes to various charities and programs, creating some of the most absolutely iconic locations in America, including Rockefeller Center, where the beautiful tree is every Christmas time, and J.P. Morgan donated all of his art to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. But not everybody agreed. A lot of people, especially those that were of the old rich, saw this as going against their class. But overall, most people saw this as a beneficial way to use their vast fortunes. We then are going to look at someone on the total opposite side of the scale, and that is going to be a woman by the nickname of Mother Jones. Mary Harris Jones was nicknamed the most dangerous woman in America. She was a teeny tiny little Irish school teacher and dressmaker who became a prominent labor and community organizer. She was basically started off with this because she was so angry at the way that the women that she made dresses for treated those of the working class. She then started getting involved in kind of the labor movement, and she went out to a particular rally and was shocked by the number of children that were working in Pennsylvania factories that was at this one particular strike. and she was more upset by the horrible accidents that had befallen these children. And so she organized a series of strikes and boycotts, and the most well known of these was the Children's March. Over 200 children and adults marched from Philadelphia to to the home of the president in New York City, to Teddy Roosevelt's home. And she said, Philadelphia's mansions were built on the broken bones, the quivering ears, and the drooping heads of these children. Someday the workers will take possession of your city hall, and when we do, no child will be sacrificed on the altar of profit. The woman was pretty intense, and she was really, really good at gaining national attention to this particular problem. She later on would become one of the co-founders of the Industrial Workers of the World, a new labor group known as the Wobblies. And don't ask me why, because they don't even know why they're called that. Next, we look at this child labor that she was drawing attention to. Just a few years after her big children's march, we're going to have the creation of the National Child Labor Committee. In 1900, there were over 1.7 million children under the age of 16 that were working in factories, earning only about $1 per hour in our money today. The National Child Labor Committee employed photographer Lewis Hine, who took this photograph as well as all the other photographs of child labor that we've looked at before, to capture the plight of these child workers. And as a result of this committee, many states started limiting or banning child labor, but it wasn't national yet. So we created the Children's Bureau. This group tackled a variety of issues that affected children, including labor and health and safety, and still continues to do so today. This was attempted to be supported through the Keating-Owen Act, which prohibited the sale of interstate commerce goods that were produced by factories that employed young children. However, later on, overturned by the Supreme Court. So the question was, if these children aren't working, what are they doing? Well, this guy had the answer. Horace Mann said, if they're not working, they need to be learning. And Horace Mann started the idea of compulsory public education. That meant that your butt had to be in a classroom. And if it wasn't being done as a public state event, then that meant that the factory that you worked for had to provide you a certain number of hours of education every single working day. And so it started to improve the lives of America's working children. And eventually, the age ranges were increased so that children were protected from working at very young ages. And finally, we get to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which you will learn about in one of your focus videos. And this will also be the focus of our primary source research in our next class. So I hope you guys have a wonderful 3-day weekend, and I will talk to you guys soon.